The alarm didn't wake Alina Kovalenko. She had barely slept. At 5:47 in the morning, the apartment on Vol. Shevchenka in Kharkiv was so cold she could see her own breath. She lay still for a moment beneath 2 wool blankets and a winter coat she draped over herself sometime around midnight, listening. No explosions nearby. Just wind pressing hard against the cracked window frame and the low, persistent sound of her mother-in-law coughing in the next room. She rose slowly, the linoleum floor icy through her socks, and moved to the kitchen. The tap ran brown for 30 seconds before clearing. She filled a pot and placed it on the gas camping stove balanced on the counter. The electric burners had been useless for 11 days now. The building had power for roughly 4 hours each day, and those hours came unpredictably, sometimes at 2 a.m., sometimes not at all. Her daughter, Daria, 7 years old, was already awake. She sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a fleece blanket, a notebook open in front of her, a single candle burning beside it. School had shifted online months ago, but the internet dropped constantly, and when it did, Daria simply continued writing by hand, letters, drawings, math problems she invented for herself. "Mama, is it Saturday?" she asked without looking up. "Wednesday," Alina said. Daria nodded as if that answered something important, and kept writing. If you're new here, consider subscribing, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's continue. Across the hallway, 73-year-old Mykola Hryhorenko sat in his armchair dressed in 2 sweaters, a scarf, and a wool hat he hadn't removed indoors in 3 weeks. His wife, Helena, had gone to stay with their daughter in Lviv in October. He had refused to leave. This was the apartment where they had lived for 41 years. The wallpaper in the bedroom still had the pattern Helena had chosen herself. He wasn't going anywhere. His phone showed 4% battery. He plugged it into a small power bank, nearly drained, and waited. When the screen lit up, he had one message from Helena, *, "Did you eat something today? It's cold there. Please go downstairs to the neighbors. *. He typed back, *, "I ate. I'm fine. The candles are holding. *. He put the phone down and looked at the dark window. Outside, the city was beginning its cautious morning. Down on the street, a woman in a heavy coat pulled a shopping cart with 2 jerrycans of water. A man in an orange vest cycled past slowly, a bag of tools across his back. Life moved at a careful, deliberate pace, not defeated, but measured, as if every action had been recalculated for a world that no longer offered shortcuts. On the 4th floor of the same building, a young couple, Andrei and Sofia, had recently moved in after their apartment in another district was damaged in a strike. They brought almost nothing with them, a suitcase, a laptop, a box of Sofia's medical textbooks. Andrei worked remotely for a logistics company. Sofia was in her 3rd year of medical school, attending lectures on her phone, often in the dark, headphones on, notepad balanced on her knee. They didn't talk much about what they'd lost. There was an unspoken agreement between them, not to open that door too wide, not yet. Instead, they talked about small things, whether the water would run warm today, whether the corner shop had received flour, whether power would come on in time for Sofia's evening seminar. Outside, the sky over Kharkiv was the pale, flat gray of a Ukrainian winter morning. It offered no comfort and no threat. It was simply there, indifferent, as skies tend to be, while below it, in cold apartments and careful kitchens, people kept going. By 6 p.m., Kharkiv belonged to a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. Anyone who had lived here before the war could tell the difference immediately, the absence of cafes spilling light onto sidewalks, of teenagers gathered near the fountain on Svobody Square, of late trams clanging through intersections. This silence had weight. It pressed against the chest. Tatiana Bondarenko, 34, pulled on her reflective vest and checked the battery of her headlamp before stepping outside. She was a volunteer with a local civilian aid network, and her shift started at nightfall, which in January meant shortly after 4 in the afternoon. Her route covered 3 residential blocks, 6 elderly residents who lived alone, and a basement shelter where a rotating group of displaced families been staying since autumn. The streets were not entirely dark. Some buildings had jury-rigged outdoor lights powered by generators. Certain intersections had been fitted with battery-powered lanterns by municipal workers. But the overall effect was of a city operating at a fraction of its former brightness, shapes emerging from shadow, figures recognizable only when you were close enough to speak. Tatiana moved quickly and quietly. She knew this neighborhood well, she had grown up 6 streets over. She knew which doorbell worked and which required knocking, which elderly woman kept her keys under the mat and which one took 5 minutes to reach the door because of her hip. Her first stop was Valentina, 80 years old, who lived on the ground floor of a building with no functioning elevator and a lobby that smelled of damp concrete. Tatiana knocked twice. A pause. Then the slow shuffle of feet. "It's me, Valentina Ivanivna." "Tatiana." The door opened. Valentina stood in a housecoat and slippers, her white hair neatly combed despite the hour and the cold. She had a small kerosene lamp in her hand and her eyes, behind thick glasses, were sharp and alert. "You're early tonight," she said. "The curfew moved. I wanted to finish before 8. Tatiana stepped inside, placed a paper bag on the table, bread, canned fish, batteries, and checked the small heater in the corner. It was running on the last of the gas canister. "I'll bring a new one Thursday," she said. "Don't rush on my account," Valentina said, already moving to the stove to make tea. "Sit." 5 minutes. Tatiana sat. She had learned early in the war that refusing Valentina's tea was not an option. There was a dignity in the offering that went beyond hospitality. It was the older woman's way of remaining a host in her own home, of maintaining the terms of her own life. While the water heated, they talked. Valentina asked about Tatiana's mother, about the situation in the eastern districts, about whether the power schedule had changed again. She spoke in the measured, practical tone of someone who had processed fear so many times it had been filed away, present but managed. Outside, a siren sounded, distant, possibly from the next district. Both women paused. Listened. Tatiana checked her phone. No alert for their specific zone. They exhaled slowly and the conversation resumed. 2 blocks away, Dimitro, a 26-year-old paramedic, was finishing a 12-hour shift and beginning to walk home. He wore civilian clothes over his uniform, a habit born of caution rather than regulation. His boots were heavy with dried mud. His eyes had the particular flatness of someone operating on adrenaline reserve, not panicked, not broken, simply running on the minimum. He passed a group of 3 men huddled near a building entrance, sharing a thermos of something hot. They nodded at him. He nodded back. Nobody asked questions. That, too, was part of the new grammar of the city, a shorthand built from shared exhaustion. He reached his apartment building, climbed 4 flights in the dark, and found a note taped to his door from his neighbor, * power came at 5. Should be back at midnight. Borscht on your doorstep. *. He picked up the pot. It was still warm. He stood in the hallway for a moment, holding it with both hands, and allowed himself to feel something close to gratitude. Irina Savchenko hadn't heard her husband Pavlo's voice in 9 days. This was not unusual. There were weeks that passed with only brief text messages, "Still here, okay," sometimes just a single letter, V, which she had learned meant VSE do, everything's fine. But 9 days without even that was long enough to notice. She didn't speak about it to her children. Her son Maxim, 15, already carried too much awareness. He had started watching the news on his phone every morning with the same focused expression his father wore when reading contracts, businesslike, controlled. Her younger daughter, Natalka, 11, still asked when Papa was coming home, but she asked with decreasing frequency, as if she too was beginning to recalibrate her expectations. Irina kept the apartment running with an efficiency born of necessity. She budgeted the generator fuel by hour. She maintained a handwritten log of food supplies on the inside of a kitchen cabinet door. She knew which pharmacy 2 streets over received insulin shipments on Tuesdays and which one sometimes had antibiotics on Fridays. She was not extraordinary. She would have been the first to say so. She was simply a woman who had no option but to function. Her neighbor Oksana came by most afternoons with her daughter, and they would sit together while the children did homework or played cards by lamplight. Oksana's husband had been mobilized in the spring. She and Irina didn't always talk about their husbands. Often they talked about other things, a recipe, a television series one of them had managed to download, news from a friend who'd relocated to Poland. The conversation wasn't escapism. It was maintenance. A way of reminding each other that they were still full human beings, not just crisis managers. On one such afternoon, Maxim came home from a neighbor's apartment where a group of teenagers had gathered around a single working laptop to watch a football match. His face, for the first time in weeks, carried something lighter. "Ukraine scored twice," he said, pulling off his coat. Irina looked at him and felt something loosen in her chest. "Of course they did," she said. He grinned, briefly, boyishly, and she caught a flash of the child he had been before all of this. It lasted only a moment. Then he sat down, picked up his textbook, and resumed the serious face. But she held on to that moment. She wrote it down that night in the small notebook she kept beside her bed, not a diary exactly, more a collection of things worth remembering. The day Maxim smiled about football. The day Natalka braided her own hair for the first time. The afternoon the power came on unexpectedly and everyone in the building spontaneously played music. She wrote these things down because she was afraid of losing them, of war flattening everything into a single gray texture. The notebook was her argument against that flattening. Pavlo texted on the 10th day. 2 words, *Zivi. Liubliu. *alive. I love you. She sat on the bathroom floor and cried for 4 minutes. Then she washed her face, checked the generator fuel, and started dinner. The small hardware store on Vol. Poltavska shouldn't have still been open. By every reasonable calculation, Vasil Tretiak, 51, should have closed it months ago. Supplier chains were broken. Deliveries arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. Half his regular customers had left the city. His profit margins, which had never been impressive, were now essentially theoretical. But the store was open every morning at 8 and closed at 5, and this fact had become quietly important to the neighborhood in ways Vasil himself hadn't fully anticipated. People didn't come only to buy things. They came to find out what was available, what was coming, what had been seen at the warehouse across town. His store had become an informal exchange, of goods, yes, but also of information, of news, of the particular comfort that comes from a place being reliably present. On a Tuesday in January, the morning began with a woman asking for electrical tape and leaving with 3 rolls donated by a man who just bought weatherproofing strips. A retired engineer stopped in to explain how to rewire a Soviet-era heating element to run off a car battery. Vasil wrote it down. By noon, 4 families had heard about it. 2 streets away, a generator cooperative had formed with no official structure and no paperwork. 7 households shared 2 generators on a rotating schedule managed entirely through a group chat. Arguments broke out occasionally, about whose turn it was, about noise at night, about fuel contributions. But the system held, because the alternative was everyone going without. At the local market, a woman named Helena, not Mikola's wife, a different Helena, younger, with a red coat, had turned her vegetable stall into something closer to a community hub. She tracked which families had elderly members who couldn't stand in long lines. She set aside medicine when it passed through the market by informal channels. She kept a list on her phone of who needed what and who could offer something in return. None of this had been organized from above. It had simply grown, pragmatically and organically, from the understanding that institutions were strained and proximity was the only reliable resource. Vasil closed the shop at 5, locked the door, and stopped on the sidewalk for a moment before heading home. The street was quiet in the blue-gray dusk. A boy cycled past with a bag of bread hooked over one handlebar. Two women walked together, deep in conversation, their scarves pulled high. He thought about a phrase his father had used, "Yak bud," roughly, "somehow it will be." It wasn't optimism exactly. It was something more practical, more slot in its temperament. An acknowledgement that the future was uncertain and a refusal to be paralyzed by that uncertainty. He walked home. He would open again tomorrow. Sophia woke at 3 a.m. and couldn't explain why. No siren. No explosion. Just sudden, complete wakefulness, her heart already running fast before her mind had formed a coherent thought. She lay in the dark and waited for her nervous system to catch up with reality. She was in the apartment on Vol. Shevchenka. Andrei was asleep beside her, nothing had happened. This had been occurring 3 or 4 times a week since October. She didn't consider it a problem, exactly. She knew enough medicine to understand the mechanism, a nervous system calibrated for threat, unable to fully believe in its own safety. She knew that across Ukraine, millions of people were experiencing variations of the same disruption, difficulty sleeping, difficulty concentrating, a persistent low-frequency alertness that never fully switched off. What surprised her was how quietly it reshaped daily life. She forgot words mid-sentence, not dramatic forgetting, just small slippages, reaching for a term and finding a gap. She noticed that she laughed less freely than she once had, not because she was unhappy but because laughter had somehow become effortful, requiring a small act of permission. Andrei had his own patterns. He had developed a habit of checking the door lock twice before bed, then checking it again when he thought Sophia wasn't watching. He made lists obsessively, not because he was forgetful, but because externalizing information onto paper gave him a sense of stability that his own memory no longer reliably provided. They had talked about this once, carefully, the way you approach something fragile. "I think I'm different than I was," Sophia said. "Yes," Andrei said. "Me too." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Down the hall, Alina Kovalenko had noticed that Daria had stopped asking about the future the way children normally do. No more "when I grow up" sentences, no more plans for summer. Not from grief, Daria was not a sad child, but as if the future had simply become too abstract to project onto. She lived with an intense, practical focus on the present, today's homework, tonight's dinner, whether the candle would last until bedtime. Alina had mentioned this to a friend who worked with a children's psychological support organization, and the friend had said, "It's adaptive. She's not broken. She's just learned to live close to the ground." Alina had held those words for a long time. Despite everything, despite the sleeplessness and the forgetting and the locked doors checked twice, people continued. Tatiana, the volunteer, celebrated her birthday in January with 6 friends around a table lit by generator power, eating store-bought cake and arguing cheerfully about a film none of them had the bandwidth to finish. Mykola, the old man in the wool hat, received a video call from his granddaughter in Lviv and laughed so hard he knocked his tea over. Vasil from the hardware store took a Sunday afternoon to read a novel he'd been putting off for 2 years. These moments were not performances of resilience. They were simply life, persisting in whatever space remained. February arrived in Kharkiv with a cold that felt deliberate. The 6 people whose lives we have followed, Alina, Mykola, Tatiana, Irina, Vasil, Sophia, did not know each other well. They passed each other in hallways, at the market, on winter streets. But their lives were woven together by the shared fabric of the same city under the same pressure, and what one carried, in some diffuse and unmeasurable way, the others understood. Pavlo came home on a brief leave in the second week of February. He arrived without warning, a message at noon, a knock at the door at 7. Irina opened it and stood very still for a moment, as if confirming that what she was seeing was real. He looked thinner. He stood differently, straighter, somehow, but also more careful, the way a person stands when they have learned to occupy space with intention. Maxim shook his father's hand and then, after a pause, hugged him. Natalka climbed onto his back the moment he sat down and refused to be removed for 20 minutes. They ate dinner together. They talked about ordinary things. Pavlo asked about school, about the neighborhood, about whether the power schedule had improved. He didn't talk about where he'd been. Irina didn't ask. There was a conversation that would eventually need to happen, and they both knew it, and they both wordlessly agreed that it could wait. He stayed for 4 days and then was gone again in the early morning, before the children were awake. Irina stood at the window after he left and watched the street. It was just past 6. A thin snow was falling, the quiet, persistent kind that accumulates slowly and covers everything with the same white patience. She wrote in her notebook, *, he was here. The house felt like itself again. *. Across the city, in other apartments and on other streets, similar small dramas completed themselves and began again. Mikola received a new gas canister from Tetiana and spent an afternoon fixing a neighbor's heating element using the engineer's instructions Vasil had passed along. Sofia passed her midterm examination, answering questions on her phone in the stairwell because the signal was better there, and texted Andrei one word, *passed. He sent back 6 exclamation points and then called her immediately. Vasil opened the hardware store at 8. A woman came in asking for extension cables and left with the last 2 he had, plus the name of a man in the next district who might have more. He wrote her name in a notebook of his own. The snow continued to fall over Kharkiv. It covered the cracked pavement and the temporary barriers and the darkened street lamps and the windowsills of apartments where people were eating breakfast or doing homework or sleeping in their coats or listening to a siren in the distance and deciding, from long practice, how worried to be. The harshest reality of modern war is not found only in the images of destruction that travel across the world's screens. It is found here, in the cold kitchen at 6 a.m., in the twice-checked door lock, in the notebook filled with small things worth remembering. It is found in the daily calculation of how much fuel remains, in the birthday cake lit by generator power, in the 4 minutes of crying on a bathroom floor before washing your face and starting dinner. Resilience, in this place and this time, is not a quality people chose or cultivated or performed for an audience. It is what happens when leaving is not possible and stopping is not possible and the only remaining direction is forward, one cold morning at a time, one candle at a time, one name written carefully in a notebook so that it will not be forgotten. This is Ukraine in winter. This is the life that continues inside the war.